A World Hanging by a Thread. Europe, June 1944. The continent groaned under the iron grip of Nazi Germany. For nearly 5 years, Adolf Hitler's armies had stretched their shadow across half the world. France lay in chains, Eastern Europe bled daily on the Eastern Front, and Britain stood as the last bastion in Western Europe, battered but unbroken. The Soviet Union, staggering from colossal losses, demanded relief. The United States, rising as the arsenal of democracy, poured men and machines across the Atlantic. The fate of the war, and perhaps the century, would hinge on a single gamble. That gamble was Operation Overlord. It was to be the greatest amphibious invasion in history, more than 150,000 men, thousands of ships, and countless aircraft converging on the beaches of northern France. Yet, in the early days of June, a silent enemy threatened to undo years of planning. Not the Wehrmacht, not the Luftwaffe, but the weather. On June 4th, at Southwick House near Portsmouth, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat surrounded by maps and weather charts. Outside, the channel churned violently. Reports told of gale-force winds and dense cloud cover. Landing craft could be swamped. Paratroopers could be scattered to their deaths. Air support might be blinded. A storm could turn the largest invasion force in history into a floating graveyard. Eisenhower's dilemma was unbearable. To postpone the invasion risked more than delay. The intricate deception plans, the phantom armies near Calais, the elaborate disinformation campaigns would lose their effect. German forces might reinforce Normandy. Stalin, impatient and suspicious, might even seek his own terms with Hitler. And every extra day gave the Reich more time to strengthen its defenses. But to proceed in a storm meant hurling young men into chaos and likely slaughter. If the invasion collapsed on the beaches, the war could drag on for years, the Allies' unity itself. Key figures and the foundation of D-Day. Behind every great event stand great personalities, shaping and contesting the course of history. The story of D-Day is inseparable from the men who carried its burden. Dwight D. Eisenhower, calm yet determined, was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. His role was to hold together a coalition of nations, each with its own priorities, fears, and ambitions, and mold them into one unstoppable strike. Winston Churchill, Britain's bulldog, demanded boldness. He carried the memory of Dunkirk, the Blitz, and years of lonely resistance. For him, the invasion was not merely military, it was the redemption of his nation's sacrifices. Franklin D. Roosevelt, across the Atlantic, provided the industrial and military might of America. His leadership symbolized democracy's resolve to liberate a continent. Joseph Stalin, far in Moscow, was relentless in pressing his Western allies, with millions of Soviet lives already lost on the Eastern Front. He demanded a second front in France. His presence loomed like a shadow. If the Allies delayed too long, he might make peace with Hitler, leaving Britain and America isolated. Across the lines stood the German commanders. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, knew that Allied invasion was inevitable. He argued that the only chance was to strike the Allies as they came ashore, before they could establish a foothold. Yet his views clashed with those of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and, most fatally, with Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler's indecision, his obsession with control, and his faith in propaganda made the German defenses a patchwork of half-measures. The decision to launch the invasion had been shaped months earlier at the Tehran Conference of 1943. There, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had met face to face. Stalin demanded, "Open a second front in 1944 or risk the collapse of the Grand Alliance. In the mountain air of Tehran, the Western Allies made their promise. D-Day would come. Yet a promise alone could not guarantee success. The Allies needed to deceive Germany into defending the wrong place. Thus was born Operation Fortitude, perhaps the most daring deception in military history. Under this elaborate ruse, General George S. Patton was placed in command of a phantom army stationed in southeast England, poised, at least in German eyes, to strike at Calais. Inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, false radio traffic, and staged photographs all painted the illusion of an immense force. German intelligence swallowed the bait. Even when Allied ships sailed for Normandy, Hitler still believed Calais was the true target. While leaders debated strategy and spies spread falsehoods, ordinary soldiers waited. In camps across southern England, they lived moments of strange calm before the storm. They played cards, wrote letters home, sang songs. Some received freshly printed French francs, tokens of a country they had yet to liberate. Chaplains held services, and many young men, barely 19 or 20, knelt in prayer, sensing the weight of destiny. For some, these were their final hours of peace. The stage was set. Leaders had decided, deceivers had misled, soldiers had prepared. The pieces of history's greatest gamble stood in place. Only one question remained: when would the storm break? Into the storm. The day of days, the night of June the 5th, 1944, was thick with tension. Under cover of darkness, the first wave of the Allied invasion began, not across the sea, but from the skies. Thousands of American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions leapt into the blackness over Normandy. Their mission was to seize bridges, secure roads, and disrupt German reinforcements before dawn. Yet strong winds and poor visibility scattered them far and wide. Some landed miles from their targets. Units were broken, radios lost, weapons sunk into marshes. To any commander, it looked like catastrophe. But chaos can be a weapon. The scattered drops confused the Germans, who could not tell where the real thrust was coming from. In villages and hedgerows, small bands of paratroopers improvised, fought fiercely, and sowed panic behind enemy lines. Then came the morning of June 6th, D-Day. As dawn broke over the Channel, an armada of more than 5,000 ships appeared on the horizon, carrying the hopes of the free world. 5 beaches had been marked on the map: Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold and Sword for the British, and Juno for the Canadians. At Utah Beach, despite confusion in landing zones, American forces pushed inland with lighter losses. At Gold, Juno, and Fateful Sword, British and Canadian troops faced strong resistance, but steadily gained ground. But at Omaha Beach, history wrote its darkest lines. The cliffs above Omaha bristled with German machine guns and artillery. As landing craft approached, they came under murderous fire. Young men, most just 19 or 20, stepped off into a storm of bullets. Some drowned under heavy packs, others collapsed in the surf before their boots touched sand. Entire companies were annihilated within minutes. The beach became a slaughterhouse. In the midst of this chaos was Robert Capa, the famed war photographer. Armed only with his camera, he stumbled ashore with the first wave. Seasick, terrified but relentless, he captured the rawest moments of D-Day, blurred, trembling images of men crouched behind obstacles, faces contorted with fear, determination, and disbelief. His photographs, few that survived, would become immortal symbols of courage and carnage, proof that war was not glory, but survival. Despite the horror, something remarkable happened at Omaha. When strategy failed and commanders faltered, individual courage took over. Small groups of soldiers crawled forward, finding gaps, scaling bluffs, silencing machine gun nests one by one. There was no grand maneuver, no perfect coordination, only men who refused to surrender. By afternoon, the impossible had become reality. The Americans had carved a foothold on Omaha. At terrible cost, nearly 3,000 casualties, the beachhead was secure. D-Day, the day of days, was not won by flawless plans, but by the relentless bravery of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The invasion had begun. Europe's liberation was underway, but the struggle was far from over. The human face of war. War is measured not only in strategies and battle lines, but in human lives, saved, lost, and forever changed. On June the 6th, 1944, amid the thunder of guns and the chaos of invasion, the human face of war revealed itself in its rawest form. On the blood-soaked sands of Omaha and the hedgerows of Normandy, medics and stretcher-bearers worked with unimaginable courage. Crawling through machine gun fire, dragging the wounded from surf and sand, they tended to shattered bodies with little more than bandages and morphine. Many carried no weapons. Their only protection was a red cross painted on a helmet or an armband. Yet they stood in the deadliest places, choosing to save rather than destroy. Soldiers later recalled the sight of medics kneeling in open fields, working feverishly over the wounded as bullets snapped above their heads, a vision of humanity amid slaughter. Beyond the beaches, in the villages of Normandy, the first French civilians emerged from cellars and barns after years of silence. Families blinked into the daylight, dazed by the roar of tanks and the strange sound of English and American voices. For them, liberation arrived not as a parade, but as disbelief. Was the nightmare truly ending? Children ran cautiously toward Allied soldiers. Mothers wept openly. Old men embraced the strangers who had come from oceans away. In those moments, freedom was not a slogan. It was the ability to speak one's own language, to see one's flag again, to hope. The human cost was shared across nations. On Juno Beach, Canadian soldiers stormed ashore, many of them farm boys and factory workers who had never seen Europe until that morning. By day's end, 300 Canadians lay dead, their sacrifice stitched into the soil of Normandy. At Gold Sword, British troops pressed inland through fire, haunted by memories of Dunkirk and determined never to retreat again. Their courage, bought with heavy losses, ensured that the bridgehead held. Across the lines, German soldiers fought with equal desperation. Among them were teenagers of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth, boys barely 16 or 17, molded by years of propaganda. They fought ferociously, not out of strategic insight, but out of indoctrination, convinced that to die for the Reich was honor. Allied troops were stunned to face such young opponents, their fanaticism a tragic testament to a regime that had stolen their childhoods and sacrificed their futures. Yet even as liberation spread, war's darkest shadow lingered. Allied bombs, meant to delay German reinforcements, often fell upon French towns and villages. Churches crumbled, homes vanished, and families who had endured years of occupation perished in the very days meant to bring them freedom. By the end of the Normandy campaign, some 4,000 French civilians would die in these bombings. For many survivors, joy at liberation was laced with grief. The human face of D-Day was not one of triumph alone. It was the face of medics risking everything to save strangers, of French villagers stepping into the light after years of fear, of Canadian and British soldiers giving their lives for freedom, of German youths dying for a lie, and of civilians caught between the hammer and the anvil of war. In these faces, the true story of June the 6th was written, not only in strategy and victory, but in sacrifice, sorrow, and the fragile hope of humanity. Breaking the wall victory on June the 6th was only the beginning. The true test of the invasion came in the days and weeks that followed, as the Allies fought not only German steel, but also the brutal reality of attrition. Inside the German command, division reigned. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel argued passionately that the Allies must be destroyed on the beaches, struck before they could consolidate. His opponent, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, believed the opposite, that armored reserves should be held inland, committed only when the enemy revealed his main thrust. Hovering above them all was Adolf Hitler, whose refusal to delegate authority paralyzed the German defense. On the crucial morning of June the 6th, Hitler slept. His staff, terrified of waking him, delayed requests for counterattacks. By the time he stirred and issued orders, it was too late. The Allies had dug in. As German commanders bickered and hesitated, the Allies slowly tightened their grip. The lodgment in Normandy expanded, beach by beach, hedgerow by hedgerow. Progress was measured not in sweeping maneuvers, but in yards of bloodied ground. The city of Caen, a key objective for the British, became a ruinous battlefield. Weeks of bombardment reduced much of it to rubble, killing thousands of civilians. When British forces finally entered, their victory felt hollow, an achievement soaked in tragedy. Meanwhile, American troops turned their focus north toward Cherbourg, the vital deep-water port. The terrain of the bocage, dense hedgerows and sunken lanes, favored the defenders. Every advance was costly. German resistance was fierce, but the momentum of Allied numbers and firepower could not be denied. On June 26th, Cherbourg fell, though at the price of thousands of lives, and a harbor left in ruins by retreating German forces. For soldiers on the ground, these battles often felt like sacrifices without purpose, friends lost for a village, a crossroads, or a stretch of farmland. Yet each painful advance chipped away at Hitler's Atlantic Wall, breaking the illusion of invincibility. Amid the smoke and destruction, another figure began to rise: Charles de Gaulle. Returning from exile, the tall, austere general asserted himself not as a guest of the Allies, but as the rightful leader of France. In villages newly liberated, he walked among civilians with an air of destiny. His message was clear. France was not merely a battlefield to be fought over. It was a nation reclaiming its sovereignty. This political assertion caused friction with the Allies, but for the French people, it was a powerful symbol. Liberation was not only about military victory, it was about national rebirth. By midsummer 1944, the wall of German occupation had begun to crack. The Allies had paid dearly in both soldiers' lives and civilian suffering, but the path toward Paris and the heart of Europe was opening. The question remained: how much more blood would be spilled before freedom was fully restored? Legacy of D-Day. By the summer of 1944, the tide of war had turned. The landings at Normandy had opened the long-awaited Second Front, and from those beaches, the Allied armies would begin the march to liberate Paris, cross the Rhine, and ultimately bring down the Third Reich. But the cost was immense. On D-Day alone, nearly 3,000 Americans died on Omaha Beach. Thousands more, British, Canadian, and Free French, gave their lives in the first hours of the invasion. Behind them lay villages reduced to rubble, families broken, and more than 4,000 French civilians killed in the crossfire of liberation. Freedom, it turned out, carried a terrible price. Yet from sacrifice came something enduring. D-Day was not simply a military victory, it was a symbol. It demonstrated that free nations, when united, could accomplish the impossible. It proved that ordinary men, farm boys from Virginia, students from Montreal, miners from Wales, could shape the destiny of the world. And it marked the beginning of the end for a tyranny that had once seemed unshakable. The legacy of June 6th lives on in many forms. In the quiet cemeteries of Normandy, where endless rows of white crosses stand against green fields, each name tells a story of courage. In the rebuilt towns of France, where streets still bear the names of foreign soldiers, gratitude is etched into daily life. And in the international order that followed, the cooperation forged on D-Day laid the groundwork for alliances that endure to this day. But the legacy is not only triumph, it is also a reminder of fragility, the ease with which freedom can be lost, the staggering cost required to reclaim it. For the young men who never returned, for the civilians who perished under friendly fire, for the German youth who died for a false vision, the lesson is sobering. War spares no one. And so, every June, when the winds blow across the Norman coast, the world remembers. Not only the strategies, the generals, or the victories, but the humanity, the suffering, and the hope that defined the Day of Days. D-Day was the moment when history itself seemed to hold its breath, then exhale into a new future. But one question lingers still. Was it truly the day that ended tyranny, or merely the beginning of another struggle for freedom?